The courtroom was silent. The judge, an elderly man with a stern face, adjusted his glasses and looked down at the farmer standing before him. The farmer, a tall man with sun-worn skin and calloused hands, held his hat tightly in his hands. His eyes, however, were steady, unshaken. "Mr. Johnson," the judge said, his voice echoing through the chamber, "you have no proof. Your claims are baseless. This court dismisses your case." Gasps filled the room. Whispers rippled like a wave among the spectators. The farmer clenched his jaw, took a deep breath, and did something no one expected. He reached into his old leather bag, pulled out a thick stack of documents, and placed them on the table. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I have solid evidence." The judge's face turned pale. The lawyers at the other table exchanged nervous glances. A heavy silence took over the room, thick enough to cut with a knife. The judge picked up the papers with trembling fingers and scanned the contents. His eyes widened. His mouth parted slightly as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. Then, suddenly, 2 months earlier, the sun shined brightly over the little town of Willow Creek. It was a peaceful place where people knew each other by name and greeted one another with warm smiles. But beneath the calm surface, trouble was brewing. Thomas Johnson, a hard-working farmer, had spent years cultivating his land. It wasn't much, just 50 acres of golden wheat, a small barn, and a few cows. But it was his pride. It was his family's legacy. One day, he received a letter that made his heart sink. It was from a wealthy businessman named Richard Callaway, the owner of a massive development company. The letter stated that Thomas had been farming on land that wasn't his. According to the documents, the land now belonged to Callaway Enterprises. Thomas knew this wasn't true. His father had left him the land. His grandfather had farmed it before him. But Callaway had powerful lawyers and deep pockets. If Thomas didn't vacate the land within 30 days, he would be taken to court. With determination in his heart, Thomas sought legal help. He met with an old lawyer named Mr. Carter, who listened carefully. After a long pause, the lawyer shook his head. "I'm sorry, Thomas. Callaway's paperwork looks airtight. Unless you have something to prove otherwise, you may lose your farm." Thomas refused to give up. He went home, pulled out every old deed, receipt, and letter he could find. He searched through dusty boxes in the attic, spent nights combing through old records at the town hall, and even spoke to elderly neighbors who remembered his grandfather working the land. Days passed, then weeks. The court date was drawing near, and Thomas still had nothing solid. One evening, exhausted and hopeless, he sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. His wife, Mary, came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him. "You've done everything you can," she said gently. "Maybe it's time to—" "No," Thomas interrupted. "I won't stop. This land isn't just dirt to me, Mary. It's my father's sweat, my grandfather's dreams. If I let it go, I let them down." Mary reached for his hand. "Then keep fighting," she whispered. The next morning, Thomas visited the town's oldest resident, 92-year-old Mr. Whitaker. The old man's memory was sharp, and when Thomas mentioned his land, Whitaker's eyes twinkled. "I remember your granddaddy buying that land outright," the old man said. "There were no loans, no debts, just an honest deal with a handshake." "But Callaway has documents that say otherwise," Thomas sighed. Whitaker frowned, then slowly stood up. "Follow me, son." The old man led Thomas to a dusty wooden chest in his garage. He rummaged through stacks of yellowed paper until he pulled out a faded folder. Inside, there was a signed contract from decades ago, the original land purchase agreement between Thomas's grandfather and the previous owner. It had official seals, signatures, and dates that predated anything Callaway could have forged. Thomas's heart pounded. "This is it," he whispered. Armed with the newly found evidence, he spent the next few days gathering more records, determined to prove the truth in court. Finally, the day arrived. The courtroom was packed with reporters, townspeople, and Callaway's expensive lawyers. The wealthy businessman himself sat with a smug grin, confident that this case would be over in minutes. Then came the shocking moment, when the judge dismissed Thomas and prepared to rule in favor of Callaway. And then, Thomas pulled out his evidence. The courtroom froze. The judge's hands trembled as he flipped through the papers. Calloway's grin disappeared. The silence stretched unbearably long. And then, the judge's hands shook slightly as he flipped through the papers. The entire courtroom held its breath. Calloway leaned forward, his confident smirk now replaced with something else, concern. His lawyers whispered frantically among themselves. Judge Thompson adjusted his glasses, his face growing redder by the second. Finally, he cleared his throat and looked up at Thomas. "Where did you get these documents?" the judge asked. Thomas stood tall. "They were with an old friend of my grandfather's. These papers prove my family legally purchased the land decades ago. Your Honor, I was telling the truth all along." The judge turned his gaze toward Calloway's lawyers. "Do you have anything to say about this?" The head lawyer, a man in a sharp gray suit, hesitated before rising to his feet. He cleared his throat and attempted to compose himself. "Your Honor, we will need time to review these documents." "No, you will not," Judge Thompson interrupted. His voice carried authority, shaking the courtroom. "You had plenty of time to present your case. You claimed your evidence was airtight. But these documents prove otherwise." He slammed the papers onto the desk in front of him. "Mr. Calloway, do you have any explanation for this?" Calloway clenched his jaw. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. His entire plan was falling apart, and the whole town was watching. The judge exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. He then looked straight at Thomas. "Mr. Johnson, I owe you an apology. This court made a mistake in dismissing you earlier. You presented clear and undeniable evidence that this land rightfully belongs to you." The crowd erupted into murmurs. Some people gasped. Others exchanged looks of shock. Calloway's face turned as red as a tomato. Judge Thompson banged his gavel. "This case is no longer dismissed. In fact, I am overturning my decision. Mr. Johnson, your land is yours, and this court officially recognizes that." The room fell silent for a moment before cheers broke out among the townspeople. People clapped. A few even whistled. Thomas took a deep breath, his chest finally feeling lighter. He had one. But then, Calloway slammed his fists on the table. "This isn't over," he growled. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Calloway's eyes were wild with fury. He turned to his lawyers, barking orders. "Find another way. Challenge the authenticity of those papers. There has to be something we can use." The lawyers hesitated, but Calloway's anger pushed them into action. One of them stood up. "Your Honor, we demand an investigation into these documents. We believe they may have been tampered with." Gasps filled the room once again. Thomas narrowed his eyes. "Are you accusing me of forgery?" The lawyer straightened his tie. "We're saying that these papers are old. It's possible they've been altered. We request forensic analysis before any final decision is made." Thomas clenched his fists. Calloway was grasping at straws, trying to delay the inevitable. But deep down, Thomas knew he had to see this fight through to the very end. The judge sighed heavily, clearly frustrated. "Very well. The court will allow an independent expert to review the documents." He turned to Thomas. "If your evidence is real, you have nothing to worry about." Thomas nodded firmly. "I have nothing to hide." The gavel came down again. "This hearing is adjourned until the results are in." The courtroom slowly emptied, but Calloway lingered. As Thomas gathered his papers, Calloway stepped up beside him. His voice was low, dripping with venom. "You think you've won?" he hissed. "I don't lose. You have no idea who you're messing with." Thomas turned to him, looking him straight in the eye. "I don't care how much money you have, Calloway. The truth is the truth." Calloway's lips curled into a sneer. "We'll see." Then he walked away, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. Thomas watched him go, a sense of unease settling in his stomach. He had won today, but the battle wasn't over. Calloway wasn't the type of man to accept defeat, and Thomas had the feeling things were about to get much worse. The next morning, Thomas was tending to his farm when he noticed something strange. A black SUV was parked at the edge of his property. Inside, two men in suits sat watching him. His gut twisted. Who were they? What were they doing here? He stepped closer, trying to get a better look. But before he could reach them, the SUV sped off, kicking up a cloud of dust. Thomas wiped his brow, his heart pounding. Something wasn't right, and he had a feeling that Calloway wasn't done playing dirty. That night, Thomas lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The court had recognized his evidence, but Calloway was not backing down. And now, strange men in black SUVs were watching his land. Mary turned over beside him, resting a hand on his chest. "You're not sleeping," she murmured. Thomas sighed. "I can't. I have a bad feeling, Mary. Calloway won't stop. He's got too much money, too much pride." She squeezed his hand. "We'll get through this. The truth is on our side." But even as she said it, a small crack of fear slipped into her voice. The next morning, Thomas was up before the sun, checking the fences around his property. The encounter with the SUV still bothered him, and he wanted to make sure nothing had been tampered with. Everything seemed fine, until he reached the barn. The heavy wooden doors, which he always kept locked, were wide open. His heart slammed against his ribs. He rushed inside. The sight made his stomach drop. His tools were scattered across the ground, some of them broken. Feed sacks had been slashed open, spilling grains all over the floor. A few of his cows stood nervously in their pens, as if they had been disturbed. Thomas clenched his fists. This was no accident. Someone had done this on purpose. His first thought was Calloway, but there was no proof. Not yet. Thomas hurried back to the house and called the sheriff. Within an hour, Sheriff Dale, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache, pulled up in his cruiser. After surveying the damage, the sheriff let out a long whistle. "Looks like someone really wanted to send a message." "You think it's Calloway?" Thomas asked. The sheriff scratched his chin. "It wouldn't surprise me. But proving it? That's another story." Thomas tightened his jaw. "So what do I do? Just let him keep coming after me?" Sheriff Dale shook his head. "I'll put in a report and increase patrols in the area." "But Thomas, men like Calloway don't like losing. If he's got people willing to break in here, he's not done." Thomas felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had won in court, but this fight was far from over. 2 days later, the forensic team arrived to examine the documents Thomas had submitted in court. It was a nerve-wracking process. They took scans, used special lights, and ran tests that Thomas didn't even understand. The wait was unbearable. Each day felt like a lifetime. Thomas kept working on his farm, trying to focus, but every time he saw a car slow down near his property, he braced himself for more trouble. Then, on the 4th day, the call came. Mr. Carter, his lawyer, sounded relieved. "Thomas, the results are in. The documents are authentic." Thomas exhaled, finally allowing himself to breathe. "Thank God. The judge is scheduling a final hearing for next week. Once that's done, Calloway won't have any legal ground to stand on." For the first time in weeks, Thomas felt hope. Maybe this nightmare was finally ending. But that night, as he sat on his porch, staring at the stars, the black SUV returned. It didn't stop this time. It just slowed down enough for him to see a shadowy figure inside. Then it sped off into the darkness. Thomas's fingers curled into fists. Calloway wasn't done, and whatever came next, he had to be ready. The day of the final hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed once again. Reporters had come from nearby towns, drawn to the drama of a small farmer taking on a billionaire. Thomas sat beside Mr. Carter, his hands folded on the table. Calloway sat at the other end of the room, his expression unreadable. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Then, the hearing began. Judge Thompson cleared his throat. "After reviewing the forensic results, this court confirms that Mr. Johnson's documents are genuine and legally binding. The land in question is, without a doubt, his rightful property." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Thompson continued, "Therefore, all claims made by Calloway Enterprises are dismissed." Applause erupted. Some of the townspeople even cheered. Thomas felt relief flood through him. It was over. He had won. Or so he thought. Because just as the gavel came down, a loud boom echoed through the courthouse. The windows shook. A few people screamed. Thomas's blood ran cold. That sound, it came from outside. Sheriff Dale was already moving toward the doors, his hand on his gun. Thomas and Mary exchanged a terrified glance before racing after him. The moment they stepped outside, their hearts dropped. The barn, his family's barn, was on fire. Flames roared into the sky, thick black smoke curling into the air. People were shouting. Someone was calling for the fire department. Thomas's legs moved before his mind even caught up. He ran toward the blaze, but strong hands grabbed him, holding him back. Sheriff Dale. No, Thomas. You can't go in there. My animals, Thomas choked. The fire's too big. Dale yelled. It's a setup. Someone did this on purpose. Thomas's heart pounded, and he knew, without a doubt, exactly who was behind it. Calloway. This wasn't over. It was only getting worse. The fire crackled and roared, swallowing the barn in an angry inferno. Smoke billowed into the sky, turning the afternoon sun into an eerie orange glow. The heat was unbearable, pushing Thomas back even as every fiber of his being screamed at him to run into the flames and save what he could. Sheriff Dale's grip on his arm was strong. You can't go in, Thomas. You'll never make it out. Thomas struggled, his heart racing. My animals. I already radioed for help. Dale shouted over the roaring flames. They'll be here soon, but you gotta stay back. Mary was sobbing, clutching her hands to her chest. The townspeople had gathered, whispering and watching in horror as the fire raged. Then, a loud crack split the air. The roof of the barn collapsed inward. Sparks shot into the sky like fireworks. Thomas's breath hitched. Everything inside, his equipment, his livestock, his memories, was gone. He stood frozen, his fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. His land was safe, but Calloway had just sent a message. This isn't over. The wail of sirens filled the air as fire trucks pulled up, their lights flashing against the smoke-filled sky. Firefighters jumped into action, spraying water on the flames, but Thomas knew it was too late. The barn was beyond saving. Sheriff Dale's face was grim as he turned to Thomas. We both know who did this. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry from the smoke and rage. Calloway. The sheriff nodded. But proving it? He shook his head. That's gonna be tricky. Thomas's jaw clenched. He wasn't stupid. Calloway wouldn't have set the fire himself. He had men for that, people who did his dirty work while he sat in his glass office and pretended to be respectable. One of the firefighters approached. We'll do a full investigation, but from the looks of it, this was arson. Sheriff Dale sighed. That means it's a crime scene. He turned to Thomas. I need you to think. Did you see anyone suspicious? Thomas thought of the black SUV that had been lurking around his property, the men in suits watching him, the way Calloway had glared at him after losing in court. I didn't see them do it, Thomas admitted. But I know it was them. Dale put a firm hand on his shoulder. Then we'll find proof. But deep down, Thomas knew that Calloway would be one step ahead. That night, the farm was eerily quiet. The fire had long since died out, leaving behind only the blackened skeleton of what had once been his barn. The air still smelled of smoke. Thomas sat on the porch, staring at the ruins, his hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. Mary sat beside him, her eyes red from crying. We should leave, she whispered. Take the kids and go somewhere safe. Thomas turned to her. And then what? Let Calloway win? Let him take everything we built? Mary wiped her eyes. I don't want to lose you, Thomas. That man doesn't play fair. I know, Thomas said, his voice steady. But if we run now, we lose everything. She nodded slowly, understanding, but the fear never left her eyes. Then, from the darkness, a pair of headlights appeared at the end of their driveway. Thomas's muscles tensed. Stay here. He grabbed his shotgun, just in case, and walked toward the approaching vehicle. The car stopped a few feet away. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, with slicked-back hair and a sharp suit. Not one of Calloway's usual goons. Mr. Johnson, the man said smoothly, hands in his pockets. I was hoping we could have a little chat. Thomas narrowed his eyes. Who are you? The man smiled. Let's just say I represent interested parties. Thomas's grip tightened on the shotgun. You work for Calloway. The man's smile didn't fade. I work for people who don't like losing. He took a slow step forward. You've made some powerful enemies, Mr. Johnson, and they don't take kindly to people who don't know when to quit. Thomas's jaw clenched. That a threat? The man chuckled. Not at all. It's a business proposition. He pulled out a piece of paper and held it out. Calloway is willing to offer you a settlement. You drop your claims, walk away from the land, and he'll pay you more than it's worth. Thomas didn't even glance at the paper. Not for sale. The man sighed, as if disappointed. You sure you want to make this hard on yourself? Look what happened to your barn. A white-hot anger burned in Thomas's chest. He took a step forward, towering over the man. You tell Calloway I'm not scared. You burn my barn, I rebuild it. You send your lawyers, I'll fight them. This land is mine. I'm not going anywhere. The man's smile finally faded. His eyes darkened. Then you leave us no choice. He turned, walking back to the car. The engine roared to life. Before he drove off, he rolled down the window. Accidents happen, Mr. Johnson. Be careful. Then he was gone. Thomas stood there, fists shaking. He knew exactly what was coming next. And this time, Calloway wouldn't just go after his barn. He'd go after everything. Thomas watched the red taillights of the sleek black car disappear down the dark country road. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest. He had expected Calloway to fight dirty. But this was something else. Mary stepped onto the porch, her voice trembling. What did he say? Thomas exhaled sharply, forcing himself to calm down before answering. Calloway made me an offer. Walk away. Take the money, and this all stops. Mary's face paled. And if you don't? Thomas turned back toward the charred remains of their barn. Smoke still clung to the air. Then we're in real trouble. She covered her mouth, eyes welling up with tears. Oh, Thomas. He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I won't let them scare us off, Mary. This is our home, our land. I don't care what Calloway throws at us. We stand our ground. But deep down, he knew. Calloway wasn't done. The next morning, Thomas drove into town. The moment he stepped into the sheriff's office, Dale looked up from his desk, his face grim. I was about to call you, Dale said, motioning for Thomas to sit. We found something at the scene of the fire. Thomas sat, his heart pounding. What is it? Dale slid a plastic evidence bag across the desk. Inside was a silver lighter, engraved with a fancy monogram. R.C. Richard Calloway. Thomas's blood boiled. That's his. Dale nodded. Looks that way. But here's the problem. We can't prove he was the one who used it. Thomas's jaw clenched. You think he's stupid enough to do it himself? No, Dale admitted. But if we can tie this lighter to whoever actually set the fire, we might have enough to charge someone. Thomas rubbed a hand down his face. And if we don't? Dale exhaled. Then Calloway walks. Again. Silence settled between them. Thomas felt the weight of the battle pressing on him. Calloway had money, power, and people willing to do his dirty work. But Thomas had something stronger. The truth. I need to find out who Calloway used, Thomas muttered. If I can figure out who actually set that fire, I can take him down. Dale studied him carefully. You willing to take that risk? Thomas met his gaze. I don't have a choice. Back at the farm, Thomas worked harder than ever. He fixed fences, checked on the remaining livestock, and did everything he could to keep his mind clear. But Calloway wasn't going to let him breathe. Later that afternoon, Mary came running out to him, holding her phone. Thomas, it's the bank. He wiped his hands and took the phone. This is Thomas Johnson. A hesitant voice answered. Mr. Johnson, this is Linda from Willow Creek Bank. I'm afraid we have some bad news. Thomas's stomach sank. What is it? She hesitated. It's your loan. The one for your farm equipment. We received notice that your loan has been called in. Thomas froze. What? Someone bought the debt from the original lender. And now they're demanding immediate repayment. His grip tightened on the phone. Who bought it? A pause. Then, Calloway Enterprises. His vision blurred with rage. That snake. First, he tried taking his land. Then, he burned his barn. Now, He was trying to bankrupt him. Linda's voice was soft. I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson. If you can't pay the full amount by next week, the bank will have no choice but to seize your assets. Thomas swallowed hard. I understand. He hung up. Mary's face was pale. What do we do? Thomas set his jaw. We fight. Calloway wanted to play dirty? Fine. Thomas was about to get even dirtier. That night, Thomas sat on his porch, going over every possible move in his head. Then, a thought hit him. The lighter. If Calloway had someone burn his barn, that person must have been paid. And money always left a trail. Thomas needed answers, and he knew exactly where to get them. An hour later, he pulled up to Sam's Bar and Grill, a dimly lit dive on the edge of town. The kind of place where Calloway's men did their drinking. He stepped inside. The room was filled with smoke, laughter, and the clinking of beer glasses. Then he saw him, Eddie Mendez, a known thug, one of Calloway's regular goons. And the way Eddie's eyes widened when he saw Thomas, that confirmed everything. Thomas strode up to him, slamming his hands on the table. We need to talk. Eddie chuckled nervously. I don't know what you're talking about, farmer boy. Thomas leaned in. Your boss made a mistake. Eddie tried to play it cool. Look, I don't know anything. Thomas pulled a photo from his pocket. A close-up shot of the silver lighter. Eddie's face drained of color. Thomas smirked. Now, you want to tell me who lit that fire? Or should I take this straight to the sheriff? Eddie swallowed hard. His hands trembled. I didn't mean for it to go that far, he stammered. I was just supposed to scare you. Thomas's stomach turned. So it was you. Eddie nodded quickly. But it wasn't my idea. Calloway paid me to do it. He gave me the lighter himself. Thomas clenched his fists. He had him. He had proof. And now? It was time to take Calloway down for good. Thomas's heart pounded as he locked eyes with Eddie Mendez. The bar's noisy chatter faded into the background. All that mattered was the confession, the proof that Eddie had just given him. You just admitted to a crime, Thomas said, his voice low and controlled. And you just confirmed that Calloway ordered it. Eddie swallowed hard. Look, man, I didn't want to do it. I was just following orders. Thomas leaned in closer, his voice a growl. And what do you think happens now? You think Calloway's going to protect you when the sheriff gets his hands on this? Eddie's hands trembled. He darted nervous glances around the bar, as if expecting Calloway's men to jump out at any moment. I can't go against him, Eddie hissed. You don't get it. Calloway's dangerous. Thomas slammed his hand on the table, making Eddie jump. And I'm not. His eyes burned with fury. You burned my barn. You nearly killed my livestock. And now Calloway is trying to take my farm from me. I have nothing left to lose. Eddie's breathing was ragged. He looked around again, sweat beading on his forehead. Then he whispered, if I talk, he'll come after me. Thomas leaned back, keeping his voice steady. Then we make sure he can't. Eddie's gaze darted to the door, then back to Thomas. His mind was racing, calculating, deciding. Then, finally, his shoulders slumped. There's a paper trail, Eddie muttered. Calloway paid me under the table, but the money came from one of his shell companies. If you find the records, you'll have him dead to rights. Thomas's pulse quickened. Where do I find them? Eddie hesitated. Then, he pulled a crumpled napkin from the table and scribbled an address on it. He slid it across to Thomas. Calloway has an office on the edge of town. It's not one of his public ones. It's where he keeps the dirtier stuff. Records, deals, bribes. If you can get in there, Eddie swallowed, you'll find what you need. Thomas pocketed the napkin. And what about you? Eddie's hands shook as he grabbed his drink. If Calloway finds out I talked, I'm a dead man. Thomas studied him. Eddie was scum, no doubt about that. But he also looked terrified. If you testify, Thomas said carefully, I can't talk to the sheriff. See about protection. Eddie shook his head. No way, man. I just gave you what you need. You take him down and maybe then I'll talk. Thomas exhaled sharply, then stood up. He had what he needed. Now, it was time to make his move. The drive to the secret office felt longer than it was. Thomas gripped the wheel, his mind running through every possibility. Calloway wouldn't keep the records out in the open. He'd have them locked up tight. But if he could get inside, if he could find the proof, Calloway would finally go down. Thomas pulled up a block away and killed the headlights. The building was small, barely noticeable, with no signs or markings. Just a dull gray door with a keypad lock. He took a deep breath. Breaking in wasn't exactly legal, but Calloway had burned his barn, tried to steal his land, and sent goons after him. The law hadn't stopped him before, so Thomas wasn't playing fair either. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. After 2 rings, a gruff voice answered. "What do you need?" Thomas smirked. Bobby Carter, his cousin, was the closest thing the town had to a hacker. If there was a way into this office, Bobby would find it. "I need to get past a keypad lock," Thomas said. Bobby chuckled. "Breaking and entering. Huh? You sure about this?" Thomas clenched his jaw. "I don't have a choice." A pause. Then Bobby sighed. "All right, text me a picture of the keypad." Thomas did as instructed. A moment later, Bobby whistled. "Cheap model. Probably a 4-digit code. See if the keys look worn down." Thomas squinted. The numbers 1, 3, 5, and 7 were slightly faded. "Try 1357, Bobby said. Thomas punched in the numbers. Beep. The door clicked open. Thomas grinned. "I owe you 1. You owe me 5, Bobby muttered. "Be careful." Thomas slipped inside. The office was dimly lit, cluttered with file cabinets and stacks of paperwork. Thomas moved quickly, rifling through drawers, searching for anything tied to Calloway's illegal dealings. Then he found it. A folder labeled Payments, Willow Creek. His hands shook as he flipped it open. Inside were documents detailing payments to multiple people, including Eddie Mendez. The dates matched the fire. The money had come from a shell company owned by Calloway. This was it. Proof. Thomas took out his phone and snapped pictures of every document. He tucked the folder under his arm. Then, a noise outside. Footsteps. Thomas's breath hitched. Someone was coming. He needed to get out now. He shoved the folder under his jacket and darted toward the door. But just as he reached for the handle, the door swung open. A massive man stepped inside. Calloway's head enforcer, Mason Briggs. Thomas barely had time to react before Briggs's fist came flying. It slammed into his gut, knocking the air out of him. Thomas stumbled back, gasping for breath. Briggs cracked his knuckles. "Mr. Calloway figured you'd show up here." Thomas gritted his teeth. Of course he did. Briggs lunged again. Thomas dodged, barely avoiding a second blow. But he wasn't a fighter. He was a farmer. And Briggs? Briggs was a trained killer. Thomas knew he couldn't win this fight. But he didn't need to. He just needed to get out. Briggs came at him again. Thomas grabbed a metal chair and swung. Crack. Briggs staggered, cursing. It wasn't enough to stop him, but it gave Thomas the opening he needed. He bolted. Out the door. Down the alley. His lungs burned as he sprinted toward his truck. Behind him, Briggs roared, "Get back here, Johnson." Thomas jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. His hands shook as he started the engine. Briggs was charging at him. Thomas floored the gas. The truck sped off, kicking up dust. His heart thundered in his chest. His mind reeled. But he had done it. He had the proof. And now? Calloway was finished. Thomas's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his foot pressing hard against the gas pedal. The truck's engine roared as it tore down the empty road, leaving behind the darkened office, Briggs's furious shouts still echoing in his ears. His heart pounded against his ribs. The folder tucked under his jacket felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. This was it. Proof. Proof that Calloway had ordered the fire. Proof that he had tried to destroy Thomas's life. But now, Thomas had a new problem, getting home alive. Because Calloway wasn't the kind of man who took defeat lightly. And Thomas had just robbed the devil himself. The road stretched ahead, dark and winding. Thomas forced himself to take deep breaths, trying to steady his nerves. He needed to think. He needed a plan. He pulled out his phone and dialed Sheriff Dale. The call rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then, Sheriff's office. Dale's tired voice answered. "Dale, it's Thomas," he said, breathless. "I have the proof." A pause. Then Dale's voice grew sharp. What kind of proof? I broke into one of Calloway's private offices, Thomas admitted. I found records, payments, names, dates. It proves he paid Eddie Mendez to burn my barn. Dale cursed under his breath. Tell me you're not still there. No, I'm on my way home. But Dale, Calloway knows. His guys were there. I barely made it out. Dale didn't hesitate. Come straight to the station. Don't go home. If Calloway's after you, that's the first place they'll look. Thomas clenched the wheel. Mary, the kids. If Calloway sent his men to the farm, his chest tightened. I have to get to my family. Thomas, listen to me, Dale warned. If you go home, you'll be walking right into a trap. But Thomas wasn't listening anymore. He was already turning off the main road. Because as much as he wanted Calloway to pay, nothing mattered more than protecting his family. The moment Thomas pulled into the long driveway of his farm, he knew something was wrong. His porch light was off. Mary always left it on when she knew he was out late. His gut twisted. He killed the engine and reached under his seat, grabbing his shotgun. He stepped out of the truck slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel. The air was too still. Even the crickets had gone quiet. Then, a shadow moved near the barn. Thomas barely had time to react before. Boom! A gunshot shattered the silence. The bullet whizzed past his ear, burying itself into the side of his truck. Thomas dove for cover, rolling behind a pile of hay bales. His heart thundered in his chest. Then he heard it, footsteps crunching toward him. Calloway's men were already here, and they had come to kill him. Thomas pumped the shotgun, his body pressed flat against the ground. His mind raced. How many of them? Where was Mary? The kids? Then, a voice called out from the darkness. Give it up, Johnson. Thomas recognized it. Briggs. I know you got the files, Briggs sneered. Mr. Calloway wants him back. Hand him over, and maybe you live through the night. Thomas clenched his jaw. And if I don't? Briggs chuckled. Then we make sure you never see the sunrise. Silence. Then, footsteps. More than one set. They were circling him. Thomas tightened his grip on the shotgun. Think, think, think. Then, from the house, a loud crash. Mary screamed. Thomas's blood went ice cold. He didn't think. He moved. Boom. He fired a shot, forcing Briggs and his men to dive for cover. Then he sprinted toward the house. Another gunshot rang out. A bullet grazed his shoulder. Pain seared through him, but he kept running. He reached the porch, slammed the door open, and froze. Calloway was standing in his living room. His sharp suit was as perfect as ever, his hands in his pockets, but his cold, lifeless eyes fixed on Thomas like a predator. Mary stood behind him, clutching their two boys, her face pale with terror. Mr. Johnson, Calloway said smoothly, I told you this would happen. Thomas lifted his shotgun, but before he could pull the trigger, a gun pressed against the back of his head. Briggs. Thomas's breath came fast. He had been too late. Calloway smiled, stepping closer. You made this hard on yourself, Thomas. All you had to do was take the money and walk away. Thomas's hands shook with fury. You're a coward. You think money makes you untouchable? Calloway sighed, almost bored. No, Mr. Johnson. Power makes me untouchable. Briggs snatched the folder from Thomas's jacket, flipping through it. He whistled. Yep, this is the real deal. Calloway nodded. Burn it. Thomas's heart stopped. No, he snarled. You destroy that and… Calloway cut him off. And what? You'll expose me? He chuckled. You had your chance, Johnson, but you lost. Briggs pulled out a lighter. Thomas's mind screamed. He had fought so hard. He had risked everything. And now? Now Calloway was about to erase every shred of proof. Briggs flicked the lighter, but before the flame touched the folder, glass shattered. Boom! A gunshot tore through the room. Briggs jerked back, a spray of red exploding from his shoulder. He screamed and collapsed. Calloway's eyes widened in shock. Thomas spun around. Sheriff Dale stood in the doorway, gun still smoking. Put your hands up, Calloway, Dale growled. It's over. Calloway's face twisted in rage. His men scattered outside, their loyalty disappearing the moment the law arrived. Mary sprinted to Thomas, clutching him tight. Dale stepped forward, cuffs in hand. Richard Calloway, you're under arrest for arson, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Calloway's jaw clenched. For the first time, he looked afraid. Thomas exhaled. His legs nearly gave out. It was finally over. Calloway was finished. But as Dale locked the cuffs around his wrists, Calloway whispered, "This isn't over, Johnson." Thomas met his cold stare. "Yes, it is." The sheriff led Calloway out. Thomas turned back to Mary, pulling her into a tight embrace. His family was safe. His farm was his. And for the first time in weeks, he could finally breathe. Thomas stood on his front porch, watching the red and blue lights of the sheriff's cars flicker against the dark sky. The farm was eerily silent now, except for the occasional murmur of deputies loading Calloway into a squad car. Mary still held onto him, her hands gripping his arm like she was afraid he might disappear. Their two boys clung to her sides, their eyes wide with fear. Sheriff Dale walked up to him, tucking his notepad into his pocket. "We got him, Thomas." Calloway's looking at a long time behind bars. Thomas exhaled. He had fought so hard for this moment, but now that it was here, he felt hollow, like part of him couldn't believe it was actually over. "Are you sure?" Thomas asked. His voice was hoarse, his body aching from the bruises and the burn of the bullet that had grazed his shoulder. Dale gave him a hard look. "We have enough to keep him locked up. The documents, Mendez's testimony, and now attempted murder. This case is airtight." Thomas swallowed, nodding. Dale patted him on the shoulder. "Go inside. Be with your family. We'll handle the rest." Thomas turned, looking at his wife and kids. The fear in their eyes was still there, like they weren't sure they could believe it either. And deep down, neither could he. That night, Thomas sat in his kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Mary sat across from him, silent, her hands wrapped around her own mug like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. The kids had finally fallen asleep after hours of comforting them, reassuring them that Calloway was gone, that they were safe now. But were they? Mary finally spoke. "Do you think he meant it?" Thomas looked up. "What?" She licked her lips, her voice quiet. "When Calloway said, 'This isn't over,'" Thomas clenched his jaw. That moment replayed in his head over and over. The way Calloway's eyes had burned with rage even as the cuffs locked around his wrists. He wanted to believe it was over. But deep down, he knew men like Calloway never quit. Mary reached across the table, grabbing his hand. "We can leave, Thomas. Start over somewhere else. We don't have to stay here." He looked at her, really looked at her. Mary was scared. She had been strong through all of this. But now that the fight was over, the reality of everything they had been through was crashing down on her. And it wasn't just her. The boys. They had seen their home burned, heard gunfire outside their windows, watched armed men take over their house. Thomas had been fighting for this land, for his family's legacy. But what if staying here put them in danger? He squeezed Mary's hand. "We'll see what happens," he said softly. "But I promise you, we're safe now." Even though part of him wasn't sure if that was true. The next morning, Thomas woke up to the sound of a truck pulling into his driveway. His body reacted before his brain did. Was it Calloway's men? Had he sent someone after them? He grabbed his shotgun from the closet and stepped onto the porch, heart pounding. But it wasn't a black SUV this time. It was Bobby Carter, his cousin, the town's tech expert. Bobby stepped out of his truck, holding a laptop under his arm and looking like he hadn't slept all night. "You're gonna want to see this," he said, his voice urgent. Thomas frowned. "What is it?" Bobby glanced around and sighed. "Now." Thomas led him into the kitchen, where Mary was already pouring coffee, eyeing Bobby suspiciously. Bobby opened his laptop, clicking a few keys. "I was digging into Calloway's financials, just in case we missed anything. And I found something." Thomas leaned over the screen. "What am I looking at?" Bobby turned the laptop toward him. A list of transactions popped up. Thomas's stomach dropped. Because these weren't just any transactions. They were wire transfers. Massive amounts of money moved between shell companies. And they weren't stopping. Thomas looked at Bobby. "I thought Calloway was behind bars." Bobby nodded grimly. He is. But his money isn't. Mary paled. What does that mean? Bobby tapped the screen. It means someone is still pulling strings for him. Thomas clenched his fists. Calloway might be in jail, but his power? His reach? It was still very much alive. By afternoon, Thomas drove into town, his mind racing. Dale was already waiting for him outside the sheriff's office. You don't look like you got good news, Dale muttered. I don't, Thomas admitted. Calloway's money is still moving. Someone's still working for him. Dale cursed. I had a feeling this wouldn't end that easy. They walked into his office, where Dale pulled out a file. I just got off the phone with the state prosecutor. They're building the case against Calloway, but the trial is still months away. Thomas frowned. What's stopping him from getting out? Dale sighed. His lawyers. They're already pushing for bail. Thomas's stomach twisted. You're telling me there's a chance he could walk free? Dale looked at him seriously. Yeah, a real good chance. Thomas inhaled sharply. Then we have to find out who's still working for him. We need to cut off his power before he gets out. Dale nodded. I'll put my best guys on it. But Thomas wasn't waiting around. He had fought too hard to let Calloway slip away now. And if the law couldn't stop him, Thomas would. That night, Thomas sat on the porch, shotgun across his lap, staring into the darkness. Mary came out, wrapping her arms around herself. What now? Thomas's jaw tightened. Calloway's still got people working for him. He's got money, influence. And if we don't stop it now, he'll be back. Mary shivered. What do we do? Thomas exhaled. He had spent this whole time defending himself, defending his land, his family. But Calloway wasn't stopping. And maybe it was time to stop playing defense. Thomas turned to Mary, his voice firm. We take the fight to him. This wasn't over. Not yet. And this time, Thomas wasn't waiting for Calloway to make the next move. The wind howled through the fields, rustling the golden wheat in the moonlight. Thomas sat on the porch, his shotgun resting across his lap. Every muscle in his body was tense. He had fought too hard to let his guard down now. Mary sat beside him, her hands wrapped tightly around a warm cup of coffee. Neither of them spoke, because they both knew this wasn't over. Calloway may have been behind bars, but his reach was still stretching out like a shadow over their lives. His money was still moving, his men were still working in the background, and if they didn't act fast, he'd find a way to slip through the cracks. Thomas wasn't going to let that happen. Not after everything they had been through. Not after what Calloway had done to them. Mary finally broke the silence. What's the plan? Thomas exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. We cut him off. Mary's eyes flickered with worry. How? Thomas stared out into the darkness. We find out who's moving his money. And we stop them. Mary nodded. But Thomas could see the fear behind her eyes. She wasn't just scared of Calloway. She was scared of what he was becoming. And maybe she was right. But Thomas didn't care. Not anymore. This wasn't just about his farm now. This was war. The next morning, Thomas met with Bobby Carter at a small diner on the edge of town. Bobby had his laptop open, fingers flying across the keyboard. All right, he muttered. I've been digging into Calloway's accounts. The money is still moving through his companies, which means someone is pulling the strings for him. Thomas leaned forward. Who? Bobby sighed. That's the thing. It's not just one person. It's a network. He turned the screen toward Thomas. Rows of transactions, company names, and wire transfers filled the display. Bobby tapped the screen. These accounts? They're all connected to people Calloway used to do business with. Lawyers, board members, investors. They're all working to keep his money safe while he's locked up. Thomas clenched his fists. So how do we stop it? Bobby hesitated. It's not that simple. We need more than just this paper trail. We need someone inside his operation. Thomas's jaw tightened. Someone like Eddie Mendez. Bobby's eyebrows raised. You think he'll talk? He doesn't have a choice. Later that night, Thomas found Eddie exactly where he expected, at the bar. Eddie sat hunched over a drink, looking like a man who had too many problems and not enough solutions. Thomas slid into the seat across from him. Eddie flinched. Jesus, man. You can't sneak up on people like that. Thomas ignored him. We need to talk. Eddie sighed, rubbing his face. I already told you what I know. Thomas leaned in, his voice low. Calloway's still moving money. We need to find out who's helping him. Eddie's eyes darted around. I can't help you, man. You don't get it. Calloway's people aren't just businessmen. They don't just sue you. They make you disappear. Thomas grabbed Eddie's drink and slid it away. If Calloway gets out, you think he's gonna let you walk free? Eddie swallowed. I don't know. You do know, Thomas said, voice firm. Calloway doesn't leave loose ends. Eddie ran a shaky hand through his hair. Okay. There's a guy, Ray Mercer. He's one of Calloway's main accountants. He's been moving the money through offshore accounts. Thomas's eyes narrowed. Where is he? Eddie hesitated. Then, in a whisper, he's staying at the Regency Hotel, downtown. Thomas stood up. That's all I needed. Eddie grabbed his arm. Wait, what are you gonna do? Thomas pulled free. End this. The Regency Hotel was a fancy, high-rise building in the city, a place where people like Calloway's rich associates stayed when they didn't want to be found. Thomas parked his truck a block away and walked the rest of the distance. His hat was pulled low, and his hands were stuffed into his jacket pockets. He wasn't armed, too risky in a place like this, but he had something just as dangerous. The truth. Inside, the lobby was polished marble and golden chandeliers. Thomas walked right up to the concierge. I'm looking for Ray Mercer. He's expecting me. The woman at the desk glanced at a computer screen. Room 1412. That was too easy. Thomas took the elevator up to the 14th floor, his heartbeat steady. He reached room 1412 and knocked. A voice called out. Who is it? Delivery. Thomas lied. A few seconds later, the door cracked open. Ray Mercer was a short, balding man with expensive glasses. His eyes widened the second he saw Thomas. Who the? Thomas shoved the door open and stepped inside. Mercer stumbled backward. Who are you? Thomas shut the door behind him. I'm the man Calloway tried to destroy. Mercer paled. I don't know what you're talking about. Thomas took out his phone and held it up. On the screen was a copy of the financial documents linking Mercer to Calloway's illegal payments. Mercer's face turned ghost white. You have two options, Thomas said, stepping closer. You can help me bring Calloway down, or you can go down with him. Mercer's hands trembled. I can't. Thomas's voice hardened. You can, and you will. Mercer swallowed. His forehead was beating with sweat. He knew the truth. He was already caught. Finally, his shoulders slumped. What do you need me to do? Thomas exhaled, finally feeling the weight start to shift. We take his empire apart, one piece at a time. Back at the farm, Mary was pacing the kitchen when Thomas walked in. She rushed to him, her hands gripping his jacket. Where were you? Thomas took a deep breath. Ending this. She shook her head. Thomas, I'm scared. He pulled her into his arms. I know, but it won't be much longer. She looked up at him. Are you sure? Thomas thought of Ray Mercer, of Calloway rotting in his jail cell, unaware that his entire empire was about to be ripped apart. He thought of everything Calloway had taken from them, and he thought of what was about to happen next. Thomas met Mary's gaze. Yeah, he said. I'm sure. Because this wasn't just about stopping Calloway anymore. It was about destroying him. And for the first time, Thomas knew exactly how to do it. The sun rose slowly over Willow Creek, casting long golden shadows over the farm. But Thomas Johnson wasn't looking at the sunrise. He was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, staring at the documents Ray Mercer had given him the night before. Calloway's entire financial web, laid out in front of him. Every shell company, every hidden offshore account, every dirty deal. This wasn't just proof of fraud and conspiracy. This was a map to Calloway's downfall. Mary stood by the counter, arms wrapped around herself, watching him with worried eyes. Thomas, this is dangerous. Thomas met her gaze. We knew this wouldn't be easy. She shook her head. You already got the proof. You already put him in jail. Why are we still doing this? He exhaled, rubbing his temples. Because Calloway isn't done. His people are still out there. His money is still moving. And if we don't stop him now, he's gonna come back. Mary bit her lip. And what if we push too far? Thomas looked down at the papers. That was a risk he was willing to take. Because this time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting to make sure Calloway never hurt anyone again. Sheriff Dale's office was quiet when Thomas walked in later that morning, a thick folder tucked under his arm. Dale looked up from his desk, eyebrows raising. I was hoping you'd come by. Thomas dropped the folder onto the desk. You're going to want to see this. Dale flipped it open. As he read through the documents, his face darkened. Son of a... He exhaled sharply. This is more than enough to bury Calloway. These accounts, these transfers. This isn't just fraud, Thomas. Dale looked up. This is organized crime. Thomas nodded. It's bigger than just him, isn't it? Dale sat back, rubbing his jaw. Yeah. If Calloway's been moving money like this, that means he's connected to people way higher up. If we go after him now, we might be kicking a hornet's nest. Thomas's fists tightened. Good. Let's kick it. Dale exhaled. You sure about this? Thomas's eyes burned with determination. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Dale studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, but we gotta do this the right way. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. We're bringing in the feds. By nightfall, the FBI had arrived. 2 black SUVs pulled up outside the sheriff's office, and out stepped a team of serious-looking agents in dark suits. One of them, a tall man with sharp blue eyes and a military stance, walked straight up to Thomas. Mr. Johnson, he said, flashing a badge. Agent Eric Maddox. I hear you have something for us. Thomas handed over the files. Everything you need to put Calloway away for good. Maddox flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. This is enough to start an investigation. But if Calloway still has people on the outside, they won't go down without a fight. Thomas's jaw clenched. Let them fight. I'm done running. Maddox gave him a long, measuring look. Then he held out his hand. All right, Mr. Johnson, he said. Let's take him down. 2 days later, the courthouse. The media frenzy outside the courthouse was unlike anything Willow Creek had ever seen. Reporters, cameras, news vans, all gathered, waiting for the hearing that would decide Calloway's fate. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Thomas sat near the front, his hands folded tightly together. He could feel Mary's presence beside him, her hand resting on his arm. Sheriff Dale sat on his other side, his face unreadable. Then, the doors opened. Richard Calloway walked in, still wearing his expensive suit. But he wasn't the same man who had strutted into this courtroom weeks ago. No, this time, he looked pale, tense, because he knew. He knew what was coming. The judge cleared his throat. Court is now in session. The prosecution stood. Your Honor, new evidence has surfaced that directly ties Mr. Calloway to organized financial crimes, including fraud, conspiracy, and illegal business practices. The judge adjusted his glasses. Go on. The lead prosecutor walked to the front of the room, holding up a thick stack of papers. These documents show that even while incarcerated, Mr. Calloway continued to move money through a network of shell companies, bribing officials, and orchestrating criminal activity from behind bars. Calloway's lawyers immediately stood up. Objection. This is highly circumstantial. The prosecutor didn't flinch. Actually, Your Honor, it's not. We have a direct witness statement confirming these activities. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Calloway's eyes narrowed. Who? The side doors opened, and Ray Mercer walked in, escorted by FBI agents. Calloway's face drained of color. Mercer sat down, adjusting his tie with shaking hands. Under the courtroom lights, he looked terrified, but he still lifted his chin and said clearly, I worked for Richard Calloway. I helped move his money. And I have proof. The room exploded. Calloway lunged from his seat, eyes burning with rage. You little rat. The judge slammed his gavel. Order. Calloway's lawyers tried to regain control, but it was too late. The evidence was there. The testimony was damning. And Calloway? He knew he had lost. 30 minutes later, the judge made his ruling. Given the overwhelming evidence, this court denies Richard Calloway's bail request. Additionally, we are expanding the charges to include federal financial crimes. The gavel slammed. Calloway was done. Thomas exhaled, his entire body sagging with relief. He had won. The fight was finally over. Or so he thought, because just as Calloway was being escorted out, he turned his head, just enough to look Thomas in the eye. And then he smiled. A slow, knowing, dangerous smile. And in that moment, Thomas knew. Calloway was going away for a long time. But this war wasn't over. Not yet. Thomas sat on the porch that evening, the sky painted in streaks of pink and gold as the sun dipped behind the horizon. The air smelled of earth and wheat, but it didn't bring him the peace it once did. Not after the way Calloway had smiled at him. Not after the way his gut twisted with the certainty that something wasn't right. Mary stepped outside, her arms wrapped around herself. "It's over," she said softly, sitting beside him. "You did it, Thomas." Thomas didn't answer. His hands rested on his lap, fingers twitching. "You don't believe that," she murmured. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I should. He's locked up. His accounts are frozen. The feds are taking over." Mary studied him. "But—" Thomas clenched his jaw. "But that smile, Mary." He wasn't beaten. He wasn't angry. He was waiting. Mary shivered. Waiting for what? Thomas had a sinking feeling he already knew. And he was about to find out real soon. 3 days later, the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dale was leaning back in his chair, sipping on a steaming cup of coffee when the call came in. His face darkened immediately. "You sure?" he muttered into the phone. Thomas sat across from him, his entire body on edge. Dale hung up and looked at Thomas. "You were right." Thomas's stomach dropped. "What happened?" Dale sighed. Calloway made a move. Thomas leaned forward. "How?" "He's in jail." Dale shook his head. "Doesn't matter. He still has people out there. And they just pulled the trigger." Thomas's breath hitched. "Who?" Dale's lips pressed into a hard line. "Ray Mercer." Thomas's world tilted. "What?" Dale exhaled heavily. Feds were keeping him in a safe house before the trial. Last night, someone got to him. 2 gunshots to the chest. Dead before they even found him. Thomas's hands curled into fists. Calloway's people had just sent a message. No one betrays Calloway and lives. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That means I'm next." Dale's expression darkened. "Yeah." Silence stretched between them. Then Dale said, "We need to move your family. Now." By nightfall, Thomas was packing. Mary moved quickly, stuffing clothes into suitcases while their boys clung to her. Their faces were pale, confused. "We're leaving?" Caleb, their eldest, asked. Mary forced a smile. "Just for a little while, sweetheart." Thomas's gut twisted. This was exactly what Calloway wanted. To drive them out. To make them run. And it was working. Sheriff Dale was waiting outside, a black SUV ready to take them out of town. Thomas hesitated at the front door, his eyes roaming over the farm, his land, his home, everything he had fought for. He clenched his jaw. No, he wasn't running. "Thomas," Mary called, voice urgent. He turned, facing her and the kids. His heart felt heavy. "I need you to go," he said. "But I'm staying." Mary's face crumpled. "No, no, Thomas. We do this together." Thomas placed his hands on her shoulders, pressing his forehead against hers. "I need to end this." Tears welled in her eyes. "Then I'm staying with you." He shook his head. "I won't put you or the kids in danger." Mary swallowed hard, her hands gripping his shirt. "Promise me you'll come back to us." He held her tight. "I promise." Then, with a heavy heart, he watched as Dale drove his family away. And Thomas? He stayed behind, waiting, because he knew Calloway's men were coming, and he would be ready. Midnight, the farm. The night was quiet, too quiet. Thomas sat inside the house, shotgun in hand, eyes trained on the front door. The lights were off. The house was dark. He was waiting. Then, a noise outside. His grip tightened on the shotgun. He moved silently, peering through the window. 2 shadows moved near the barn. Then a third. Thomas's pulse quickened. They were here. His stomach coiled with rage. These men had destroyed his barn. They had threatened his family. They had killed Mercer. And now? Now they were coming for him. He exhaled slowly, steadying his nerves. Then, he moved. The first man never saw it coming. Thomas burst out of the house, shotgun raised. Boom. The blast sent the first intruder sprawling, his weapon flying from his hands. The second man shouted, spinning toward Thomas. But Thomas was faster. Boom. The second man hit the ground, groaning in pain. The third one ran. Thomas chased him, sprinting toward the barn. The man dove behind a tractor, fumbling for his pistol. Thomas kicked it away. The man looked up, eyes wide with terror. "Please," he stammered. Thomas pressed the shotgun to his chest. "Who sent you?" The man swallowed hard. You know who." Thomas's heart pounded. "Calloway." The man hesitated. Then, he smirked. And in that moment, Thomas knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. Not even close. Because Calloway's real plan hadn't even started yet. The night air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and sweat. Thomas stood over the trembling man, his shotgun pressed against his chest, his heart pounding like a war drum. "Tell me what Calloway's planning." His voice was calm, but underneath it was rage, pure and untamed. The man licked his lips, his hands shaking as they hovered in surrender. He knew he wasn't walking away from this unscathed. Then he said something Thomas wasn't expecting. "It's already done." A slow chill crept down Thomas's spine. "What do you mean?" The man exhaled shakily, his smirk faltering. "Calloway knew you'd fight back. He counted on it. While you were waiting for us, he was making his real move." Thomas's stomach dropped. Mary, the kids, they weren't safe. In an instant, he turned and ran, his shotgun forgotten in the dirt, his boots pounding against the ground as he sprinted for his truck. The man called out behind him, "It's too late, farmer. Calloway doesn't lose." But Thomas wasn't listening. He slammed the truck door, gunned the engine, and tore out of the driveway, tires spitting gravel into the night. He grabbed his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed. Ring, ring, ring. No answer. His heart pounded faster. Mary always answered. Always. He pressed harder on the gas, pushing the truck past its limit as the road blurred beneath him. "Come on, Mary," he muttered under his breath. Pick up. Pick up." Then, a voice. But it wasn't Mary. It was Calloway. "Hello, Johnson." The voice slithered through the speaker, smug and triumphant. Thomas's grip on the wheel turned to iron. "Where is she?" Calloway laughed. A slow, satisfied sound that made Thomas's vision blur with rage. "Safe," Calloway said. "For now." Thomas's knuckles turned white. "If you touch them—" "Oh, relax," Calloway interrupted. "I'm not a monster, Thomas. I'm a businessman. And I have a proposition." Thomas's stomach twisted. "What do you want?" he growled. "You," Calloway said simply. "You give yourself up. Stop fighting, and I'll let them go." Thomas's hands shook. This was it. The moment everything had been leading to. Calloway wasn't going to win this war from behind bars. So he was forcing Thomas to end it himself. Surrender, or lose his family. A cold, quiet fury settled in Thomas's chest. Calloway thought he had one. But he had underestimated the one thing Thomas had that he never would. A man fighting for something more than himself. Thomas exhaled, his voice steady. "Where?" The abandoned mill, 30 minutes later. The old mill sat on the outskirts of town, its windows broken, its rusted metal walls barely standing. It was the perfect place for a man like Calloway to stage his final play. Thomas pulled up, stepping out of his truck, his hands raised. A dozen of Calloway's men surrounded the place, armed, dangerous, and in the center of them, Mary. Her hands were tied, her face streaked with tears, but when she saw Thomas, something in her eyes lit up. Hope. Thomas clenched his fists. Then, from the shadows, Calloway stepped forward. Even in a prison-issued suit, he still carried himself like a king. "Nice of you to come," he said, smirking. "I knew you'd choose the noble path. It's so predictable." Thomas held his ground. "Let her go." Calloway sighed. "You really don't get how this works, do you?" He motioned to his men. Two of them stepped forward, aiming their guns at Thomas's chest. "See, Thomas, I don't need you alive," Calloway continued. I just need you to stop being a problem. And once you're gone, your farm, your land, your legacy, all of it will be mine. Mary's gasp broke the air. No. Calloway smiled. Goodbye, Johnson. He lifted his hand. A gunshot rang out. But it wasn't Thomas who went down. It was one of Calloway's men. Then another. Then another. Chaos erupted. Men shouted. More gunfire rang out. And from the distance, Sheriff Dale's squad cars roared into view. Sirens blared. Lights flashed. Calloway's men scrambled, caught completely off guard. And in the middle of it all, Thomas lunged forward, tackling Calloway to the ground. The two men hit the dirt, fists flying. Calloway fought like a man possessed, but Thomas had something more. He had everything to lose. He drove his fist into Calloway's face. Once, twice. Blood spilled. Calloway groaned, trying to roll away. But Thomas grabbed him by the collar and hissed, "It's over." Calloway spat blood, grinning through broken teeth. You think so? He sneered. You think this ends with me? Thomas narrowed his eyes. You're just a man, Calloway whispered. The people I work for? They don't lose. Thomas's stomach twisted. But before Calloway could say another word, Sheriff Dale's boots slammed into the ground beside them. Richard Calloway. Dale barked, You're under arrest. Thomas let go, panting, as Dale's deputies dragged Calloway to his feet. The crime lord struggled, but the fight was gone from him. He had lost. For real this time. 3 days later, the farm. The morning sun stretched over Willow Creek, casting long golden rays over the land. Thomas stood on his rebuilt porch, watching Mary sip her coffee, the kids playing in the yard. For the first time in months, there was peace. Calloway was gone, this time for good. The feds had dug into his network, exposing the web of crime he had built. His associates had flipped. His power was gone. And now? Now, Thomas had his life back. Mary turned to him, her eyes soft. It's really over, isn't it? Thomas exhaled, letting the tension melt away. Yeah, he said, wrapping an arm around her. It's over. The wind rustled the wheat, the sun warming his face. For the first time in a long, long time, Thomas Johnson could finally breathe.